You're listening to Gender Agenda Season 2. This is brought to you by the Asia Gender Network, the world's first Pan-Asian network dedicated to moving capital to close the gender gap in Asia. Each episode, we take a closer look at trends and issues in philanthropy and discuss the changing gender landscape in the region, featuring conversations with an exciting lineup of distinguished guests and our AVPN gender equality ambassadors. Freedom is a fundamental human right, yet for millions of women and girls across Asia, that freedom is actually still shaped by violence, exploitation, and systems that were never really built to protect them. Welcome back to the AVPN Gender Agenda. I'm Kelly Latimer, and today we're diving into one of the most complex and urgent conversations of intersection of gender-based violence and modern slavery. Now, these issues don't exist in isolation. They are deeply connected to power, to education, culture, and economic inequality. And while the realities can feel really heavy across the region, there are leaders working to reshape systems, from global policy and data advocacy to grassroots education and youth leadership as well. Joining me today, I'm very excited because we've got two extraordinary voices really driving this work forward. Katharine Bryant is director at Walk Free, an international human rights organization committed to eradicating modern slavery. She leads efforts that engages governments, businesses, civil society, and she's also the co-author of the Global Slavery Index, one of the most comprehensive data sets shaping global accountability and action. Also joining us, Sohini Bhattacharya is Senior Advisor to the Accelerator for Shifting Gender Norms Through Education, and she's also an AVPN Gender Equality Ambassador. Now, with more than 3 decades in the development sector, including her leadership at Breakthrough, Sohini has actually worked to transform gender norms and build youth leadership to prevent violence before it begins. Today is going to be an interesting one. We're going to be exploring how education, data, and community-driven solutions can help dismantle systemic barriers and what it truly takes to build a future grounded in dignity, safety, and equality. So let's start with talking to Katharine, because Katharine, I would love to know, how on earth did you get into this sector and what made you think, you know what, this is my focus. I am going to delve into modern slavery and how we can get.
Thank you so much for the question. So I've actually been involved in anti-trafficking and anti-slavery work for about 15 years, primarily at the Walk Free, which is an international human rights organization which focuses on these issues. But I've also worked across various international organizations and civil society. I actually fell into this work a little bit by accident. I've always cared about human rights. I've always been very passionate about freedom. I also care deeply about education. I actually started my career as a high school teacher in the UK. I ended up quitting that in my mid-20s, ended up traveling overseas and working in East Timor, where I volunteered with an anti-trafficking program. And what struck me about that was my manager at that time allowed me to interview people who'd experienced these forms of exploitation very early on in that process. And so I was working with women and girls who'd experienced commercial sexual exploitation, with men who'd experienced forced labor on fishing vessels, who'd then jumped ship to end up on East Timorese shores. Now, this was back in 2009, so way before any of these media scandals that highlighted the risks of forced labor within the fishing industry. And as soon as I started doing those kinds of interviews, working with these individuals, I knew that this was the career for me longer term.
Incredible. Sohini, what about you? Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing Breakthrough as well?
Well, like Katharine, I kind of stumbled into this industry fresh out of university when I didn't know really what I was going to do. Most probably I was going to go abroad and do some more studies, but I entered into it to work with a group of women, trying to build some communication materials with them on the issue of the girl child. And I discovered that most women who were much older than I was didn't have the same voice, the same ability to express opinions like I had. I was born in a family which kind of encouraged my radical militant ways, and a mother who kind of drummed it into my head that you have to stand on your own 2 feet and you have to say what you want and you have to exercise your rights and get your choices going. So one thing led to the other, and I realized that I'd love to actually work for people who do not have the same privileges that I do in expressing my opinions, having the same kind of voice and the same kind of opportunities. So that's why I started working with young women and girls quite early in life. And in everything that I have done, including social entrepreneurship with Ashoka for a long time, I tried to ensure that we have more women and more visibility for women. Breakthrough was an exhilarating and an exciting 14-year-old journey where I really entered the organization when we were just 25 of us, and I exited the organization where there are 220 of us. And for 8 years, I ran the organization on building the leadership of young people to say no to violence and to be able to actually exercise their voices and create choices in life that are of their own making. In that, we've worked on early and forced marriages, we've worked on gender biased sex selection, and also worked on creating an ecosystem of people at the community level who could change norms, not just individually, but as a community. My work right now focuses on creating the transformative approaches that I did with Breakthrough, but taking them to a more global audience so that we could build the ability of global organizations who are shifting norms, mainstream education in a much more better way, and create learning for others in the sector, not for the nonprofit, but also the for-profit sector.
Okay, let's zoom out for a little while then, and let's paint a full picture. What is gender-based violence looking like now? What is modern slavery looking like now? And how has it changed in the 20, 30 or so years that you guys have been involved in this?
At Walk Free, we use the term modern slavery, and we use that as a bit of an umbrella term that encompasses many different forms of exploitation. Common to all of these forms of exploitation are situations that people cannot refuse or leave because of some kind of coercion, deception, threats, force, etc. It includes many different international legal concepts. That includes human trafficking, forced labor, forced marriage, and debt bondage. But we understand that there are those commonalities across all these different types of exploitation. That can sound very legally. I think to put a bit more of a human face on that, we're talking about individuals, say, for example, a woman who's in domestic servitude. She might be working for a family. She might be unable to take time off. She might be underpaid. She might be experiencing some forms of sexual violence in the household. It can also include a man, as I mentioned, where I worked with people who trafficked aboard fishing vessels, who took a job offer, thought they were going to be paid and working in one particular place, maybe a factory somewhere, but instead were kidnapped effectively, smuggled across a border, and then forced onto a fishing vessel. The things with these fishing vessels is that they often don't come into ports very often, and these individuals are being forced to work under physical threats, crazy amount of hours, 20 hours a day sometimes, with very limited food and again, very limited pay. But common to both of these scenarios is this idea that you are unable to leave because of these forms of threats and violence.
And what would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions may be, especially among the policymakers, about how that exploitation actually happens?
I think we find there's often a perception it happens elsewhere, that it doesn't happen absolutely everywhere in the world. We often find that people think it's often a problem that happens in lower income countries, but we actually find evidence of exploitation in every single country around the world. We also know that countries that have higher purchasing power might also be further exposed to modern slavery through some of the goods and services that they're purchasing. So we know that forms of forced labor occur throughout global supply chains and therefore are being imported into individual countries, particularly in the G20. I think one other misconception we see is around forced marriage, and that includes situations where a woman cannot or does not consent to her marriage. We find through the global estimates of modern slavery, which we produce in coordination with the International Labour Organization and the International Organization for Migration, that there's some 22 million people living in some form of forced marriage globally, and 2/3 of these individuals are females. So we know that modern slavery is a highly gendered issue. We know it still occurs absolutely everywhere around the world, and that it does also include forced marriage alongside forced labor.
Sohini, with your lens, can you maybe weigh in on that, especially with the forced marriages? Because I feel like you would be someone who would have so much to say about this.
So, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, gender based violence and modern slavery, I would say, is very deeply interconnected through shared cycles of exploitation and vulnerability. A lot has changed in gender gender-based violence over the many years and over the work of many, many people. But yet, we know that 1 in 3 women face violence at some point in their life. In many cases, young girls, even before they turn 15, there are incidents of violence. Women and girls face disproportionate risks, often experience both gender-based violence and modern slavery due to power imbalances that is fueled by poverty, discrimination, and harmful gender norms. The fear and the dependency that is created in survivors are something that sometimes limit women and girls' ability to actually reach the full potential in their life. What we've seen in our work on early marriages, and we called it early because, yes, it's early, it's before the legal age, but it's also sometimes before a woman is ready to do it, ready to get married. It can be at the age of 21, it can be at the age of 30, So really getting married without taking the girl's choice into the equation. What we really saw through our work is that if we do work at a community level, explaining to people what is legal, but also explaining to people that women and girls have the right to exercise their choices. And if they do that, the community is not going to face any harm, but the community is actually going to grow and prosper. I think once you take that kind of an approach, communities agree that, forced and early marriages are not good for young women. When I was in Breakthrough, we managed to bring down the age of marriage by 1.8 to 2 years, actually. And we ensured that girls stay in school for a longer amount of time. And so the whole thing comes back to the fact that building young people's agency to be able to recognize what is choice for them, what is consent for them, and what, in fact, is something that they can say no to is, I think, superbly important. And even in this whole thing of being forced into domestic service or domestic labor, I feel that there are opportunities here to create much greater awareness among young people and even young people who might go into domestic labor as a service on what is a good service, what is a bad service, what are the things that you should be looking out for, what does a trafficker look like when he or she or they come and kind of work with you to get you to that opportunity that you think you are going out to. There's a whole lot of interconnectedness and cross-sections here that we should be able to keep in mind.
And I guess all of that gets sparked by education, by helping people understand. But that education doesn't happen unless you actually have data to back it up. Enter Katharine one more time when we've got the Global Slavery Index. How is that helping to change the conversation and also create a little more accountability as well? And then conversely, how are we then able to take that data and then break it back down? So you need to pass it on to you to be able to drive the conversation at community levels.
Fantastic question. So we produce the global estimates of modern slavery. That provides that global figure of 50 million people in forms of modern slavery, and that includes both forced labor and forced marriage. That in itself is a huge global advocacy tool for us. It's a cry for action that we will then use to hold governments to account to make sure they're taking this issue very, very seriously. We then at Walk Free produce something called the Global Slavery Index, which takes that 50 million figure and breaks that down for about 160 countries around the world. That Global Slavery Index aims to answer 3 key questions. So we try to answer how big is the problem, what are governments doing to respond, and then what makes people vulnerable to it. And this provides the most comprehensive data set in the world on modern slavery to really inform policymakers what they should be doing about this issue. It highlights they have a problem in their particular country, but then it also provides really clear policy recommendations of what they should be doing to try and tackle this. Alongside this, we also look at evidence around the import risk. I mentioned around G20 countries import approximately $500 billion US dollars every single year of goods that are at risk of being produced by forced labor. So that idea that it happens elsewhere, that it's something very hands-off, is not true. All G20 countries should be doing an awful lot more to respond to modern slavery, both within their own borders, but also through the goods that they are importing. So for us, data is the starting point. We are an evidence-based organization, but we very, very quickly turn that into action. We want to hold governments to account. We want to make sure that we have the advocacy, then they are driving through our evidence. So your second part of the question around then how do we use this at the community level? We know that we provide avenues, for example, for different civil society organizations, survivor-led organizations to feed into the Global Slavery Index. That's incredibly helpful for us. It obviously gives us a really rich data set that's grounded in reality. We're not relying on just what governments are saying they're doing, but actually what people say they aren't doing often. But then also it provides them a very good tool, a very good platform to then use this and say, hey, this global report says we have these problems and these are the things that we need to do about it. And then they can go and do their own advocacy work off the back of that. We support survivor-led organizations in multiple countries around the world to do just that. They take the evidence from the report and then run their own campaigns to hold their own government to account.
And Sohini, at that sort of community level then, how important are these data sets for you to back up what you're trying to say? How does it work on the ground level?
I think one of the ways in which we've handled data is to involve communities in the data collection process itself. And I think that's when the penny drops. It doesn't drop if I pull in UN data or international data and just present it to them the way we consume it at our level. We'll go back to the community and say that you yourself said that, you wanted your child to complete her education. And now you are saying, let's get her married. Where's the dichotomy? Where's the problem? And when you feed it back to them and say, look, by being in school for 2 more years, your child is going to actually get a career and is going to actually think of a career. And then you cannot say any longer that girls are not productive, they do not contribute to the society, and so let's get them married. So you are refuting your own beliefs. And that's when the penny drops and no parent can actually say no to education for their children when you kind of put it to them in that way. So those are very, very important things. Where this kind of data really becomes important is when we go to a system level place, education system or a health system, and we say that, look, this is the data that says that if we do include a whole lot of interventions on gender equality, on understanding trafficking, on understanding what a trafficker looks like, on understanding what your rights are, it makes a change to how that future shape up for that child. So that's where, data like this is most important. I think also it informs gender transformative education by highlighting the vulnerable stride tied itself to inequality. Schools can integrate this data into curricula to challenge norms. They can promote equality and they can prevent exploitation through awareness and skills building. And schools are great places for doing that because they build opinions, they build mindsets.
So would you say that that is where you would see the greatest opportunity to reshape those norms before actual harm occurs?
Yes, because schools aggregate adolescents. You get them in large numbers. Schools are also socialization processes. Schools are also seen as communities, as places that can lead, provide a road ahead. Sometimes, even if they're small village schools, elders in the village listen to the school head. So schools play a very integral part. And, all children go to school. All children should be actually finishing school. And there it is. There's a biggest opportunity that you can have on giving something to a whole group of people with scale.
And then I think maybe if we just go back to working with the governments, Katharine, working with businesses, civil societies and stuff like that. Obviously, we see a very real need, and Sohini is highlighting the very real need to effect change and quickly as well before that harm happens. How do you balance that sense of urgency? Because you must see so much, and when you're exposed to so much, that must weigh so heavy on you. But surely there's systems, there's processes, there's a fact that working with governments, organizations, civil society, businesses, and all of that, like there is that need to balance we need to do this yesterday with, okay, how can we really effect long-lasting change?
Yeah, it's a fantastic reflection. I mean, I feel like with the world as it is at the moment, there's a lot of doom and gloom, and it can feel very overwhelming. And when we say figures like 50 million people experiencing these most extreme forms of exploitation, it can feel like an insurmountable mountain for us to climb. So I think what we recognize at Walk Free is that systems change takes a really long time. Like, this is not something that we can do overnight. And therefore, we're in this for the long haul to try and actually shift these systems of inequality, of discrimination, of patriarchal gender norms, to actually really start to engage with this. And we do recognize that the government is kind of the ultimate duty bearer in all countries. They are the mechanism that is responsible for ensuring that these protections exist for vulnerable populations. They are the mechanism that ensures that education does actually address some of these harmful gender norms that we're seeing come through that drives these forms of exploitation. They should be providing the social protection, the safety nets, that mean that people don't slip through the cracks and become vulnerable to modern slavery, including forced labor and forced marriage. So definitely we see that there is a need to recognize this is not a sprint. This is a marathon that we're all committed to, but also then alongside celebrate some of the small wins that we see. And so most recently, we've been doing a lot of advocacy work in New Zealand, for example, around putting in place a Modern Slavery Act that holds business to account around what they're doing in their own direct operations, but also in their supply chains. And we saw most recently that they've actually announced a bill that they're going to be debating in Parliament. Australia is also going through a very similar process where they're looking at their own Australian Modern Slavery Act and how that can be strengthened, including things such as due diligence, where businesses are actually taking concrete action to tackle these issues in their supply chain rather than just reporting on it. So I think for us, it's about recognizing that this takes a long time, that we're in it for the long haul, but also that there have been some changes and some improvements happening along the way. And that definitely gives me hope for the fact that we can actually tackle these forms of exploitation.
And I think with the lens also of living in Singapore, where our country has literally been built from the ground up by migrant workers, by workers that really work long hours doing backbreaking work. And in a country that, despite its first world approach to everything else, still does not have a minimum wage, for example. But then you live here, and the ecosystem that it's sort of created, the understanding that, yes, we have domestic workers that help, and seeing as an employer myself just how we are trying to make things better, even if it's on a small front, whether it's saying, okay, maybe we'll pay them a little bit more. How can we work with them to upskill them as well so that when they go home, there is a sense of, I have taken home a skill that I can then go back to my community and I can show them, look, there is more to life than just doing forced labor or just doing manual labor. What does that sort of community-based work on a ground level actually look like? And I think this would be answered best by both of you.
Having done this kind of work and having relied on hired help all my life to be able to do the work that I do, I just cannot not agree on the focus and the spotlight to be turned on, especially on domestic. I feel very strongly about domestic helpers and domestic workers. Hardly any rights, hardly any entitlements, no insurance policies, no fixed hours. And I think it cuts across many countries, rich, poor, global south, global north. There is a whole focus on care economy worldwide. And I'm hoping that some of those conversations that are happening are going to be able to actually look at women especially who are working at this level, because very often poor marginalized girls find their way to be working in this. And it need not be a work of shame. It need not be something that is steeped in so much exploitation and sometimes sexual exploitation, I'm ashamed to say. Can we not look at schools providing education to young girls, making them aware of their rights, but schools also creating an ability in these young girls to say no to things? I remember a few years back, I don't remember the name of the organization, who had made this wonderful videos for a school which was in the region in India where trafficking into domestic servitude was high and is still very high. Lovely small videos that gives you a glimpse of this is how the conversation starts. This is what your trafficker can look like. This is where you should be able to backtrack and say no. Just small, simple things that children can learn at school and at a very young age, because, unfortunately, trafficking starts at a very young age. So children can learn at a very young age about those kind of things. That's where governments come in. Governments can really create a huge, huge difference by making sure that anti-trafficking education gets into national curricula, that teacher training grants and resources on gender disparities are provided, that holistic programs like a comprehensive sexuality education or a comprehensive learning education about your bodies and yourselves gets into education, and that funding for that is ensured, and that funding is actually tied to the economic opportunity of a country. Because if the women force in your country is actually going to become a labor force in your country, that is going to add to the economic power of the country as well. So, not just to do this as a rights thing. And I hate bringing that in here, but that's the language and conversation that countries need to have. That if 63% of India's women actually can join the labor force, then some $1 trillion worth of GDP is going to go up.
It can sound quite depressing to make an economic case for human rights, but unfortunately, I mean, that's what makes sense to people, right? What makes sense to business. That's what makes sense to governments. That's what they're looking for. So 100% agree. Like if we unlock the potential of women and to go into the workforce, that's going to have an impact on GDP. It's going to have an impact on the economy. I'm also thinking about domestic workers, particularly migrant domestic workers. So through our data, we know that adult migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be exploited than non-migrant workers. So we know migrant workers are a very vulnerable group. And then within that, domestic workers are a particularly vulnerable group as well. And we know that these individuals, if they're able to be paid a decent wage, if they're able to get access to training opportunities that you were just mentioning, that also can feed into the local economy where they're working, but also a lot of them send money back to their home countries through remittances, which can also drive the economy as well. So that is really important to recognize the importance of actually paying people fully for their work and the flow-on effect of that, beyond the moral argument of obviously it being the right thing to do. I think also just for domestic workers, we were talking a bit about community organising and support. With that, we've been really proud to partner with the Freedom Fund to provide support to domestic workers networks as well. So beyond giving them education before they leave around pre-departure orientation and all of this, there's also a way to actually work with people who are in country, who are domestic workers, providing with opportunities to come together to share resources, to then actually do their own advocacy work to try and strengthen the labour laws in the countries in which they're living. So that's another example of where grassroots organising can be really important to shift change.
While funding the community awareness on root causes of that, people need to have access to legal processes that really work. And for migrant workers, this becomes so much more important because, they're not in their country, they're not under the jurisdiction of some other country. So where do they go? I think that is a whole murky gray area that needs a lot of work still.
So one of the things I'll bring up is a case that recently happened in Singapore. There was a migrant domestic worker from the Philippines who'd actually been abused publicly by a man. She was physically assaulted. And the power of social media was that this was all captured on video and very quickly put up online. And what I was quite heartened by was that the authorities took it very seriously. The Philippines government stepped in and have said that they will prosecute duly. And I feel like when a stand is taken, specifically on a government level as well, it just goes to show that there is less and less tolerance and that there is more and more opportunity for you to seek help, which is really important because I feel like it's really important that the programs that are run to educate, that they have that gentle balance between being trauma-informed and understanding and educating there, but also at the same time empowering leadership. Because until we are also empowering the individuals and the communities, they're not going to feel like they can go on and continue the good work that they're doing. But what I would say is that institutions don't always get it right. I would like to know, in your opinion, where are they sometimes getting it wrong and how can we do better?
I think there are many things that institutions can be doing better. I think for me, it's about getting in place those basic protections that exist universally for everybody. So access to social protection schemes, access to unemployment insurance, access to health schemes, access to education across universally, I think is so important. And that's what we're expecting governments to actually be doing to tackle some of these underlying systems that's driving these exploitation. I think you mentioned it was a really interesting case around the power of social media as also an education tool to actually highlight these issues and to hold governments to account is another mechanism. We've seen that across the Arab states, for example, where people living under the kafala system, which is basically a tied visa sponsorship system, were able to highlight their experiences of exploitation on social media to then get access to help and to raise awareness of this. So I think social media is a really powerful social norm shifting tool to actually start having these conversations in different places. It also doesn't mean that the social media companies are always getting this right. We also know that, for example, they can be used as a bit of a recruitment platform for individual people moving overseas that then opens them up to vulnerability to exploitation. But I think there is a really powerful education piece there around social media that it's important for us to recognize and tap into.
I don't think it's all about doom and gloom. I think one thing that you have done really well, Katharine, is just sort of highlighting the shortcomings. And I think that's important because you still hold on to the hope of, yes, we can still do more. And this is what we can do. Because if we don't walk away from this conversation with the next step, what I as an individual can do to play a part, to help out, to see how we can contribute to this conversation around changing societal norms, around changing what is being done globally in my part of the world, I feel like the message then just gets lost in the sea of podcasts. We are here to incite change. And when you highlight so succinctly and so beautifully what work you're doing, what still needs to be done, and what we can do on an individual or community-based level, I think that's really, really important. Sohini, what about you? What do you think we could do better right now?
I mean, if you were an institution or a government, I would say partner with an NGO. Trust an NGO and learn more on what toolkits, what pilot, or what is it doing on addressing school-related gender-based violence, or even trafficking in high-risk areas, or even community-based gender-based violence. Strengthen laws for prosecution, which I've already said that. And then let's monitor progress through data-driven evaluations. Let's see what the data says and how the data is used to actually feed back into scaling more successful models that are already working. For many, many NGOs, they have successful models that are working. Let's try and not reinvent the wheel, but take those models and learn. And for individuals, I would say, listen to the voices of women and girls, especially listen to the survivors. I think that is one rule that we cannot turn away from. That the tendency is to find ways to disbelieve the woman. Tendency is to find a way to put the blame on the survivor. Just keep your heart and keep your ears open and listen to the voices. I think that is something as individuals we should be able to do, and not jump into conclusions and troll somebody on social media, put out our opinions on the other side of the world. It doesn't help. And if you are disbelieving a woman in the global south, you would disbelieve a woman in the global north as well. It cuts across. And learn from each other. Like the UK and the Australian government have both done a lot of work on fighting gender-based violence and bringing in many policy level changes. How can other governments learn from them? Let's look at learning not just on G7 policies, but let's make these as part of G7 policies and G20 and all the other international policymaking bodies that we have. Let's have those conversations there.
So a wonderful list. But as a listener, as someone tuning into this, going, what can I do? How can I help? What is the one thing that you would like to see me or any other listener do tomorrow to make sure that we can support the global movement to end gender-based violence and modern slavery?
I would say start at your home. If you have people working in your home, look at them. See what their rights are. See whether you are doing as best as you could to ensure that all the things that you take for granted for yourself are actually provided to people. You take a couple of days off in the week. You have fixed hours of work, fixed pay, other kinds of things. Believe in equality, gender equality. And if you do believe in gender equality, do a small act to show that you trust your daughter to go out at 12 o'clock at night wearing a short skirt. It doesn't matter to you. And trust, listen to women is what I think as an individual we all can do.
Katharine, what can I do right after this to incite change?
I also agree. Listen to women is definitely one of the main ones. But for me, I think it's also around thinking through your own kind of consumerism, how you're actually purchasing, like thinking about who made this dress that I'm wearing today? Where did it come from? Who was involved in the supply chain of putting together, manufacturing this garment, picking the cotton that went into it? And really starting to ask questions of your purchasing practices, but also of the companies that you're buying from. Lots of companies these days have to release what's called a Modern Slavery Act statement. So they have to report on what they're doing to tackle labor exploitation that occurs within their supply chain. So a lot of that information is publicly available, but consumers and us as consumers should be asking those questions and holding them to account as a result.
I was shocked to learn that some of the coats that are sold by Burberry and other labels, Italian women making those coats get 20 euros an hour for making them.
It's crazy.
I was shocked to learn that. So look at the fashion you are buying.
Yeah, completely. We see women being exploited through the manufacture of garments. It's predominantly a women-dominated industry. And that's where we're seeing these individuals being exploited, both from all the way from picking up the cotton all the way through to the manufacturing in factories as well. So yeah, definitely asking that question of who made my clothes? Because if you're not including the women that made your clothes, then you're not protecting the rights of everybody.
Incredible. Ladies, thank you so much. Today's conversation really reminds us that gender-based violence and modern slavery are not inevitable. They are the result of systems that can be challenged, redesigned, and transformed. Now, through data, education, community-driven leadership, change is already happening, sometimes quietly, but often very powerfully across Asia and beyond. I'd like to say a big thank you to Katharine Bryant and Sohini Bhattacharya for sharing their experience, their courage, and their vision for a world where dignity and safety are not privileges, but rights, and also for telling us what we can do right now to incite change. Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, please share it, start a conversation, and consider how you can support the global movement walking towards freedom and equality for all. I'm Kelly Latimer, and this has been the AVPN Gender Agenda.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Gender Agenda. Find out more about the Asia Gender Network powered by AVPN, Asia's largest network of social investors, at avpn.asia. Don't forget to follow and subscribe. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.